Are you overwhelmed by the challenge of personalizing communication for thousands of students? That's where Element 451's AI assistants come in. From nudging prospective students to guiding those already on their journey, AI assistants don't just automate, they write, build, and optimize every step of your digital campaigns. Discover how at element451.com/AI team.
Hit it! That's what I'm talking about. Wait!
Okay, now, from the beginning.
Hit it, boys.
Welcome to Reclaiming Free Speech, Democracy, and Discourse on Campus, a podcast about the post-2024 election America look. I'm Dr. Cody Nielsen, Assistant Professor of Higher Education at Western Michigan University and Executive Director of Convergence Strategies. No matter the outcome, the 2024 election will set the stage for the next decade of higher education. In this Pulse Check series, I'll interview policymakers and practitioners to discuss their outlook on higher education, the ways in which we might reestablish higher education's public trust, and what a post-2024 election will look like on college campuses. From expression of speech to civil democracy and discourse, America's higher education system is at a dramatic turning point, and we're here to break it all down. Let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to Reclaiming Free Speech, Democracy, and Discourse on Campus, a post-2024 election America. I'm Dr. Cody Nielsen, Assistant Professor of Higher Education at Western Michigan University and Executive Director of Convergence Strategies. No matter the outcome, the 2024 election will set the stage for the next decade of higher education. In this Pulse Check series, I'll interview policymakers and practitioners to discuss their outlook on higher education, the ways in which we might reestablish higher education's public trust, and what a post-2024 election will look like on campus. From expression of free speech to civil democracy and discourse, America's higher education system is at a dramatic turning point, and we're here to break it down. Let's dive into today's episode. Today, on the first episode of our Reclaiming Free Speech, Democracy, and Discourse on Campus podcast, we're talking with Dr. Desirée Anderson, Dean of Equity and Inclusion at Prairie State College and restorative justice scholar and practitioner. Desirée, welcome to this Enrollify Pulse Check series and to this conversation around democracy and free speech and restorative practices.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you all.
We're coming to you live and in person together on this conversation on the day after the 2024 election. It is not even noontime. We don't even have full election results from the U.S. House races. We're still waiting on Michigan. But we know the outcome of the presidential election, and we know the outcome of the United States Senate, and it's turning toward the Republican Party for the next term. Desirée, I'm really grateful that you're on the episode and on this podcast and have agreed to this. And we're going to dive into a lot of this work that you do. I'd like you to tell our listeners a little bit about your work, your connection with restorative justice efforts, which is going to be the center point of our conversation today, and just help us to know a little bit more about you and your background.
Certainly. Well, again, thank you for having me. And I'm always excited to talk about my work in restorative justice in particular. I kind of come to this work through a very sort of traditional student affairs, higher education background, and that I, did undergrad and grad school, and then went into the workforce and working in housing and residence life, and then moved over into sort of the multicultural affairs world in higher education. And so I've been working on colleges and university campuses for some time. And in that work, what I really discovered was this need for a reconnection to community. And how do we really think about each other as a collective body in terms of how we're going to relate to each other, how we build connections, how do we understand sort of our different lived experiences? And that really led me then to restorative justice work. And I've been engaging in restorative justice work for the last 10 years or so. And it's really been a great passion of mine because I have found that it has been a really beautiful tool when done well. It could certainly be done not well at all, but when done well, has been this really amazing tool to sort of center humanness, center people, and to sort of create a container in which people can actually hear and listen to what other people have sort of said and create an avenue for people to really learn, right? To understand the impact in ways that I think other spaces and opportunities where we try to think about accountability haven't quite been effective. We've often thought about accountability in terms of like someone else sort of making a decision as to what someone's sort of retribution or punishment should be, rather than the people who are sort of actually involved in whatever the situation is, sort of making the decision for themselves. And so really coming to restorative justice for me was really thinking about how do we involve all of the parties in sort of the understanding and the decision making. And I think when everyone is involved in that process, the long-term benefits, we still have to do more research on that, but from my own anecdotal experience, from the things that I've learned from other people, is that that's going to have a much longer lasting impact on change behavior than someone sort of arbitrarily just like, you did something wrong, this is your punishment, go forth and then don't do it again, right? And so I think that's really been my relationship to restorative justice and how I sort of approach my work. Even when I'm not in an RJ restorative justice kind of space, I still sort of lean into that perspective of how do I really coach and work with people to sort of understand from the perspective of the people who have been harmed. And on the other side, how do the people who have been impacted, understand how they, the people who caused harm, how they kind of got there, if you will. And that has been pivotal to the work that I do.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think it's really important for us to sort of have that sort of larger sort of understanding. And I'm wondering, as one of higher education sort of leading scholars on this work, if you can sort of take us back a little bit. I think there's a lot of misperceptions and misunderstandings about what restorative practice is and restorative justice is, its comparisons to trauma-informed practices. And I'm wondering if you can sort of give us a sort of overview, if you will, maybe a sort of like layman's understanding for those listeners to just sort of understand what is the sort of center point of restorative practices? How does it compare to trauma-informed practices? And what are we really talking about when we start talking about RJ work?
Yeah, so I think restorative justice has sort of an interesting history, right? And that it is often referred to as something that's sort of rooted in indigenous practices and Native American practices. And there's very deep truth to that. And I also think that there is a way in which it has sort of been conceptualized and the framework has sort of been centered that is very much still sort of within a broader Western lens, the way that it is sort of practiced here in the United States. It's very much practiced differently in other spaces. But restorative justice sort of here in the Western context and in Western context really sort of centers on this idea that you sort of have to combine a variety of different things to get to this idea of accountability, right? So the people who have been impacted, the person who has sort of caused the harm, sort of the broader community involvement in that, and sort of the decision making into that accountability. So what restorative justice really is saying that we want to engage in a sort of conversational practice that will allow deeper understanding, that is not assigning sort of punishment, that is not necessarily assigning an outcome that is sort of fixed, right? And so the beauty of restorative justice is that it is flexible, but it also can make it difficult for people to figure out what's appropriate, if you will, because there's no standard practice, right? So restorative justice really is sort of saying we're looking at accountability through the lens of harm reduction, looking at it through the lens of not necessarily that is something is illegal, right? When we think about our criminal justice system, there is a law that is in place and either you break it or you don't. Restorative justice is saying it doesn't really matter if there was something illegal happening, that you were violating law. What's happening is you're violating people. And so how do we sort of repair relationships that were broken, right? So it's a sort of call back to say that harm is about people, not about law, not about property, not about, these sort of arbitrary things that exist. And so how do we sort of help people to some sort of understand that through the actions of another, you have sort of broken whatever sort of relationship that exists that is there. And so sometimes that relationship is minimal, but there's sort of these social contracts that we sort of have with each other, right? We exist in a space where we have sort of these unwritten rules about how we exist within community, within different spaces. And within those sort of social contracts that we have, relationships are developed in a variety of different levels. And what RJ is saying is that when harm happens, is we're sort of breaking those relationships. And so how do we repair it? How do we amend that sort of brokenness that exists between parties? And the more we can sort of build community, build relationships, the easier in some ways it can be to sort of make those amends, because I am more inclined to want to make amends to somebody who I actually care about, right?
Right.
If I don't really care about you, I might still want, though, to make amends because of that social contract, right? There's a way in which now I have broken the social contract, and there's consequences that happen as a result of that. And so I may want to make amends because I have now broken the sort of social contract that exists in the broader community that I'm involved in. And so how do I kind of make amends to make sure that I am sort of repairing this sort of social contract that exists, that has sort of bore some consequences by which maybe I'm being outcast from this community I'm involved in, or I'm being looked down upon from these other people that I care about, even though I maybe didn't care about the person I harmed. So really what restorative justice is doing is sort of connecting back to the people involved, not necessarily the law involved.
Right. That makes sense. How does it compare, just again, sort of just real briefly on that, how does it compare to trauma-informed practices and some of that work that we see in trauma-informed work?
Yeah, so I think trauma-informed work really is an element of this, and it's really sort of a kind of a practice that is put into place in a variety of things, right? We might add trauma-informed practices into mediation, into restorative justice, into sort of therapy. What trauma-informed really is really thinking about how trauma manifests for people. And so how can we be conscious of the way in which somebody is showing up in a space that maybe doesn't look, quote, normal, or doesn't feel like they're being authentic, or doesn't feel like they're, responding in the way that you maybe expect a person to respond because of the fact that they are dealing with trauma. And so trauma-informed really is about understanding how trauma impacts people, and therefore making sort of corrections, if you will, or adjustments to how you are approaching a particular incident, conversation, through that lens of recognizing that somebody who's been impacted in a particular way may be more cold, more distant, or they may be more emotional, or through their trauma, they are not responding with, care and empathy because they've sort of shut themselves down or whatever. So what do we need to do to either allow them to open up, or recognize that the way that responding is just how they're going to respond because of that trauma? And so restorative justice is not necessarily a trauma-informed practice in and of itself, but there are ways in which we can bring trauma-informed into this. And more so, I'd say we're thinking more about this idea of being healing-centered, even more so than being trauma-informed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that's really important, because I think what you just said about this sort of healing-centered and the combination factor of both trauma-informed practices being a part of RJ work and restorative practices, but I think those combinations really lean toward the sense of what we're going to need in terms of healing right now. When we scheduled this Pulse Check series, and when we decided to do this, and when you agreed to be a part of it, we really had no idea what the election was going to look like whatsoever. We were, we knew that we were having this time this morning to interview and to do this. And the election could have been a number of ways. We could have been undecided. We could have been a Harris win. We could have been where we are this morning. And the whole point of this conversation, really, when it comes down to it, is for us to think about, like, the sort of like moment that we are in as a democracy, and also the moment that we are about to experience in higher education. We've already bared witness to sort of anti-DEI movements that we've seen on campus, the white rage that we have seen, the impact of what Kevin Kruger, the former CEO and president of NASPA, has described in other podcasts and other spaces as a stratification of the field, where in which he describes actually people literally fleeing from places like Florida and Texas, and other people actually going to places like Florida and Texas. And now we are going to have to bear a reckoning of what the election has been. And I use that word honestly, but I also use that word in the sense that no matter what would have happened, we would have had to bear a reckoning. What do you think, from your sort of lens as a scholar and as a practitioner, as a dean of equity and inclusion, what do you think is going to happen next? What do you think the impact of this election is going to be on this election? And then I'm going to eventually circle back of like, how does RJ come to help with the healing of this? So that's a long question, but I'd love to sort of hear your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're going to have to contend with I think institutions of higher education are going to have to fight for understanding the value, right? So I think we've seen a lot of arguments of late around, does higher education sort of hold the value, especially considering the cost that it has? And so how do we sort of continue to make the argument that higher education will always sort of have value? And then within that is sort of that, if you will, that sort of reckoning of how do we still manage to provide support and community for students who have been sort of part of these sort of historically under-resourced sort of communities, while not necessarily maybe naming them as DEI, right? Or how do we continue to put our best foot forward, if you will, in supporting all of our students, recognizing that they're going to have different needs, right? We're going to be looking at things through the lens of equity, even if we're not necessarily calling it equity. Right. So how do we sort of pivot in ways that will, allow us to continue to do the work, even if we're not necessarily naming it? And something like that sort of like feels disheartening, because it's like, I want to be able to be in a position where I can say, no, I'm going to push back and I'm going to own and we're going to stick it to, X, Y, and Z. And like, but the reality is we want to actually make sure that we're doing the work and we're supporting the people we want to support. That sometimes part of this work becomes figuring out how do we sort of navigate through language? How do we navigate through systems in ways that still provide the work that we've always done underneath new names, right? And so we think about the history of this world, everything it's shifted, but it's really just shifted into a new name, right? So we don't have, and maybe I don't want to go too deep down here, but get myself in trouble. But, the idea of like, a lot of the things that we still sort of experience, they're not new, right? They're just sort of transitioned, if you will. And so, we can do that too, right? We're doing the same thing in a new name, and I think there's ways in which we can really do that. I think we're sort of justice can definitely help support us in doing that. I think what I anticipate is that we're going to have a lot of changes and flips in terms of, thinking about things for Title IX, right? We just had, the Biden and Harris administration underneath the Department of Education put out those new regulations around Title IX, and then they were immediately sort of contested. And so we're figuring out where that's going to go. And I imagine that with this new administration, things maybe go back to where they were with the 2020 regulations, right? And so where they're going to lean maybe more in favor of one community over another. And so how do we still support students with, new regulations that perhaps are not as maybe say victim centered? Similarly with, thinking about how we think about responding to bias incidents in higher education. And the beautiful thing that I now live in Illinois, but previously lived in Louisiana. And one of the things we experienced there was, fire kind of coming in and working with the Louisiana legislature to sort of pass bills and law, right? And I imagine that same thing is going to happen in other spaces. But one of the things that came out of that was they were okay with the use of restorative justice as a tool to respond to bias incidents. And so I think what I can see and what is sort of understood is that what restorative justice can be, again, when done well, is that it really is not a tool around blame and shame. They're there, don't get me wrong, right? Blame and shame are definitely still a part of the lived experiences of people that they're having, but that's not the purpose of what a restorative process is, right? It is about developing understanding and finding ways to work together to move forward. And so I think with an organization like FIRE being like, hey, yeah, you can use restorative justice to respond to bias incidents. You can use restorative justice perhaps to respond to Title IX incidences. So I think we can really see restorative justice being an absolutely amazing tool that can help us do the kind of DEI work that I think we should be doing anyways, right? That isn't really contingent upon, sort of these institutional, like, yes, we want things to be institutionalized, but we need it to be more about the development of care and compassion and community and understanding in ways that, like, sometimes doing training doesn't do, that having particular policies in place do not do. Because policies and training don't necessarily guarantee that people are buying into them, right? And so what restorative justice can sort of offer is creating pathways and avenues for people to be more deeply embedded into it. Now, the struggle with that, though, is that the way that restorative justice sort of operates is that it really should be, and it has in it, and it is, something that's voluntary, right? And so when you consider that, of course, it becomes more effective because people who are going to agree to participate are maybe people who are sort of already open-minded there. And so the struggle, I think, what we will have in the beginning of trying to use these sort of practices is how do we get the people who are maybe anti anything to sort of buy into the concept of what restorative justice can do and can't be.
Yeah, I with all of that there, I hear what you're saying in sort of this idea of sort of breaking the check boxes, the idea of like, it's just programming or it's just another training and another policy that we either have and do this. And I really do agree with you that the voluntary sort of like modality or the pedagogy that we have practiced within restorative practices, the idea that people can opt in to this. Do you think that there is a chance? I always try to. I'm not going to say that that I stay on a sort of hopeful side always. I'm not sure if I'm feeling hopeful this morning. I know I will have to get back there, but I do know that when we have moments like this in our political system, it often creates reactionary responses. The Women's March, a huge civics lesson for the generation of college students in the last 10 years over this election. Do you think there's any chance that there will be professionals that we work with on college campuses who will wake up a month or 6 months from now and will be like, wow, like there really is work that I need to do. There is interrogation work that I need to do, reflexivity work, and that will cause them or at least invoke their willingness to voluntarily show up to do more restorative work? Like, do you think there's a potential that we could see a rise in this?
I do, actually. I was actually having this conversation with a colleague the other day, and I said, in some ways, and I was like, it sounds weird to say this, but I am somewhat glad, if you will, glad's not the right word, I'm grateful that we are in this time, and that I think for many people who have felt like, back in the day, this idea when President Obama won, we're post-racial, right? And then it sort of this feeling of like, we don't have to continue to do the work anymore, or like things are just good. And then I think sort of this resurgence of everything that has sort of happened as a result of that, increasing in hate crimes, increasing in, rolling back of sort of protections that have been in place for different populations of people, the threat of further rolling back happening, going forward, maybe is sort of opening up people to sort of reconcile or recognize that things were not maybe as positive or as post whatever as they maybe thought that they were, and giving people maybe some of that pause to reflect a little bit more around sort of what are the things that they have been maybe contributing to, or maybe the ways that they have been complacent,
Right.
And sort of allowing the things that they feel are not good for the country to sort of move forward because they haven't been maybe as outspoken, or they haven't been engaging in the local politics. They haven't really been engaged, which is, I think, is the thing I'm noticing a lot in particular, is that this election cycle in particular has been interesting, where we've seen the conversation ramp up more than I think I've previously seen around the needs to engage in more local stuff. And so maybe this will be this sort of tool that will help people figure out different ways to be connected into this work, and then therefore maybe be more open to being in a space to be more reflective through sort of a process like restorative justice that kind of gives them a guide on how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think about this a little bit in the sense that we sort of like, as a white cishet straight, cishet straight like male who is sitting in this space and has done a lot in the last decade or more around DEI work, and the folks that I often interact with that are coming, and I will just say this from a more neoliberal perspective, the sort of like, we're doing the work, we put up the Black Lives Matter sign, like, I'm LGBT inclusive, I put up a sticker, I went to a training. I think this is a moment of reckoning. Like, and I will hold back my tongue of what I would like to say, maybe like, in some platitudes of what they say in terms of just swearing and doing so. But I think that we have to make this moment a moment that we wake up and we say, we're not doing enough. We haven't really interrogated what's going on, and our complacency, our bury our head in the sand. The number of people that I have talked to that were like, I'm just really trying to avoid like this. And I'm like, I think if you are coming in a body that has been harmed historically, presently, and continuously around like what our society has done to BIPOC folks, around like women's bodily autonomy, and all of this, I think I can understand sort of drifting away. But when folks that show up in the body that I have that are like, I'm just disassociating right now, I'm like, you're not showing up. You have deflected your responsibility to be an intermediary, to be an agitator, to be a disruptor. And you have just simply said, like, I did enough. I put up my Black Lives Matter sign and I voted for such and such candidate. And I wonder if maybe restorative practices and that sort of introduction to it, and even the sort of trauma-informed practices, might give people a space to say, oh, there is a deeper conversation around harm and harm reduction and about healing that needs to take place.
Yeah. And I think the struggle is always, how do you simultaneously create a place in which people can step out of the comfort zone while also being comfortable? Right? Because in order for people to feel like I can even step in the room to start to sort of challenge my sort of complacency, my held beliefs, my whatever, is this always feeling of like, I need to be comfortable, right? And so we have to do sort of one of two things. Either it is push everyone to say, you just can't be comfortable and you just have to suck it up and you just got to do the work, right? But we also know that reality is that's not how people operate, because they don't want to walk into a space where they're going to feel that shame. They're going to feel that blame. And so how do you sort of create a space where we can comfortably say, we're going to challenge you, but we're not going to put you in a position where you feel blame and shame. And the flip side of that is the people who end up having to do the work of not making you feel shame and blame are people who are tired.
Right.
They're like, I'm exhausted and I don't want to cuddle you. I don't want to hold your hand. I don't want to do those things anymore. I need you to sort of step up, as you were just saying. And so it is this really hard place to sort of be in, and that how do we sort of create this pathway? So part of that really is to do this RJ work in sort of siloed sort of segments. But then that becomes an issue, because they're like, well, we want to create maybe a white space for white folks to challenge other white folks to do this work. We want to challenge queer folks to work with other queer folks to do this work. And then people will get upset about that, because then they'll go, well, now you're segregating us, right? And so part of this work, I think, going forward, and the work that I think will be really essential for me, is thinking about how do we, in some ways, codify okayness of segregated space to do this work. How do we simplify that in a way that makes sense for people, right? How do we articulate it in a way that when someone sees that flyer randomly, that it doesn't like blow up on social media that's like, you're having the whites only, da 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 da. And it's like, and then, but maybe through the administration, the board, the whoever is supportive of that decision, so that they can easily sort of push back and say, yes, that was designed purposely. How do we sort of challenge sort of narratives in our, locals of control, and that therefore using that sphere of influence to sort of spread out to say, these types of spaces are needed for this purpose, so that again, when that sort of person who maybe isn't from that community sees that flyer, sees that this event is happening, sees this, their immediate reaction isn't one of negative, but it's one of, oh yes, I know why they're doing that. I understand that. And so it is not easy work, and it's work that takes a long time. And I think that's the hard part about this. And that's also the hard part a lot of times for people with restorative justice, because they want punishment now, right? They want accountability now. And unfortunately, even when we offer for immediate punishment and accountability, it doesn't have the lasting effect that we need, that we want. And so this type of stuff does take time. And so part of it is also, how do we develop people's patience, considering that it's like, how much longer do I have to be patient? I think I've been patient for 400 years. I've been patient for, 56 years. I've been patient for, 70 years. And what has it gotten me? And it's like, you're absolutely correct. And we've not been intentional about the work that we were doing beforehand. And so now let's try to be intentional.
Yeah. There's so much there that we could definitely probe deeper. And I think, Desirée, this calls for a follow-up conversation, perhaps outside of this. I want to be attentive to our time and to our listeners, knowing that, we try and strive to keep this tight. And so as we sort of move toward our sort of closing, I think my big question for you, outside of all of this work, which is going to leave, hopefully for our audience, a lot of sort of further conversation they want to have, is how do you plan to take care of yourself? You are a dean of equity and inclusion. You are a scholar, and you are a BIPOC individual who now holds further weight and trauma from another election. What are you doing, or what do you plan to do in the immediate aftermath to take care of yourself?
That's a good question. I'm going to go to a concert tonight and enjoy myself. But then after that, I think really it's just sort of taking time to be in community with people who I know can support me, and who can uplift me. And I think that's just being really mindful about what spaces I'm in over the next couple of weeks. And then, recognizing that I can't always be in a quote safe space. So just, preparing myself that I'm going to have to deal with whatever's sort of coming my way. And then knowing that I can create an avenue to be in sort of a space to debrief, reflect with people who can hold me, who can refill my cup as I have to pour into other people's cups.
Yeah. Well, Desirée, thank you for being on this episode around democracy and free speech and restorative practices in the sort of post-2024 election. Really appreciate your time, and really looking forward to hearing from our audience about how this conversation went for them.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
This Pulse Check mini-series has been brought to you by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.